group. Okay. I think we can start, and I think the best way to go is now that Judy has made the presentation, and I think it's time for us to engage and have a discussions about this, and especially how disinformation is something that is, number one, not only endangering our society and not conveying the truth and the facts as they are, but as well as deliberately misguiding our people and impacting health, and even sometimes, like Judy said, is deadly and is causing people to die, and misinformation that is, about COVID, about vaccine, and in a very dictatorial situation, like in the Horn of Africa, where I'm now zooming in, where disinformation is deliberately used by authoritarian authorities in terms of manipulating the wider public, or try to advance a political agenda. So I wanted to invite everybody, all of us, to engage and have discussions on this. And I would like first, before, I'm sure we all listen, Judy, and Judy would come back to that. If anybody would, have any point or question to raise, please put on your camera, raise your hand, and we will be happy to take advantage of the time.
Might be just you and I chatting, Omar, which is fine.
Yeah, I hope if anybody wants to join, that's fine. But Judy, coming back to you, disinformation did not start during COVID. It has been before, and it has been widely used for people to deliberately misguide the societies or undermine democracy, or to better lies so that they can cheat on their societies. Is it being felt now more strongly than before, or it was more or less the same? Some people can say danger is a danger. If you are using in a dictatorial environment or oppressive environment, you talk about like the case in Zimbabwe. But which one was more dangerous when you compare and look into that?
You mean pre-COVID or post-COVID? I think so. You're right. I mean, the question, misinformation and disinformation have long been with us. And another way of talking about disinformation before that came a buzzword was talk about propaganda, right? We're familiar with governments pushing out a particular line to influence their populations. Again, that's nothing new. You might call the pyramids a piece of propaganda for the pharaohs, or so there's nothing new. I think the key thing, and this is why COVID I think has brought this to light so strongly, is the speed with which information now moves around the world. So I can now wake up in the morning, go on Twitter, say something, push a button, and it could be read by people in Australia and South America whom I have never met and know nothing about me and don't know whether they should or can trust me, and then they can share it and share it again. So I think that's the big difference. And the challenge is that what we're trying to deal with a problem that is exacerbated globally with global solutions often. And actually many of the ways that these rumors, for example, which might start somewhere very far away and come back to communities, need to be tackled is often within the local community. Somebody trusted who can explain why that's not the case. Somebody trusted who can help unpick where that information has come from and tackle it. So that's the first thing. And obviously, COVID, like information, spread because we can now also move around the world much more fluidly than we could before. And so I think we were all suddenly facing the same illness all at the same time, which we haven't had in the past. In other pandemics, it's the illness has moved much more slowly, which has meant that people have had time, for example, to understand and tackle the challenges raised by that particular illness, like Ebola, within those communities, so that once they spread out, people were ready with the information needed to address concerns, whereas it just spread too quickly for that to happen. So I think the simple answer is, it's mis and disinformation is nothing new. It has been hugely exacerbated by both the illness itself, the pandemic itself, but also the nature of the internet.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, it's very clear. Yeah, it has been with us, but you know, COVID has exacerbated. But when you look at governments have, you know, adopted several measures for the COVID and, you know, emergency situations. And for us, for instance, those of us in Africa, we feel that access to information has also been restricted because under the pretext of, you know, COVID-19. And that has denied journalists who wanted to investigate or uncover the truth and challenge, you know, government spending on COVID. The aid that the World Bank, multilateral institutions, EU, the UN are bombing into our government is, for instance, in Africa, then, you know, journalists were barred or denied, or some of them, their life was endangered just because of that, trying to uncover the truth. How best we, as journalists, media communities, civil society, forces for democracy, how can we best tackle disinformation, misinformation? So, because, you know, this pandemic that we are all battling will be with us for months or maybe years to come. So, but we get to tackle disinformation. How best do you think we can tackle it?
I think there are a number of ways to tackle it. I think the first has to be continue to support independent media. Funding needs to flow to independent media because journalists have both faced financial challenges as a result of COVID, but also, as you say, in many instances have found it much more difficult to do their jobs because of the kinds of legislations that were introduced by government. So they need more support than ever. So I think firstly, we need to be campaigning for more funding to go to journalists. I think the other thing is we need to continue to campaign to hold governments to account. In many countries, we saw the introduction of what was called emergency legislation, as we heard from Faith, that has never been repealed. And therefore continuing to campaign and raise public awareness, because I think in many cases, the public doesn't necessarily know that those pieces of legislation haven't gone away, to campaign for those to be removed as quickly as possible so that people are not limiting. And then the third, I think, is to act in solidarity with one another, to support each other in communities of practice as journalists, as activists, to support one another to push back against draconian legislation, push back against restrictive regulation. And that also, I think, is really important when it comes to tackling the social media companies, because in many cases, it is the government regulation that's the problem, but sometimes it's also the practices that have been introduced by the social media companies, right? And the more we can elevate the voices of communities who are most affected by some of these pieces of the community guidelines and so on, I think the more influence we're likely to have with social media companies to change policy.
Okay, yeah. And one last question. Disinformation. Disinformation. One of the critical issues that is hampering is investigative journalism, and that is having a serious impact on all of us. So I just wanted to see, yes, supporting independent media is very critical, but do you think that particular attention should be also paid on investigative journalism to uncover the truth and expose that these are deliberate lies, falsehoods led to misguide the public or endanger the society by corporates or politicians.
Just 1 second, as is the way when this working from home thing, somebody has just knocked on my door. Just 1 second and I will answer the question.
That's fine. That's fine.
Sorry, that was the dog. You've got the dog barking, you've got people knocking on the door, there's a storm going on outside. It's all of the excitement that we have these days when we're working from home. So what has been really interesting, and I think the two previous speakers on their lightning talks picked this up, is one of the positive benefits that I see that have come out of COVID is the need to collaborate more, because in order to properly understand, the truth that's beneath what the government, for example, says, you need to triangulate lots of different pieces of information, and you may not have access to that or resources to have that. So one of the interesting things I really think that's happening, and I'm glad to see the European Commission and others supporting, is networks of investigative journalism, because a piece of information, for example, about we're very interested at the moment around IP, intellectual property, how the companies are behaving regarding the vaccines. Well, the companies might be headquartered in one country, the vaccine might be manufactured in another country, it might be distributed in a third country, and so being able to piece those together to build a story, I think, is really having hugely, as we've seen with Pegasus and others, huge impact, positive impact.
I think, yeah, thanks. So with the few minutes that we have, I just want to, if any of the participants want to ask you a question, please feel free to go ahead. The other question that is also very important for us is when it comes the question of disinformation, Judy, is about the safety of journalists, and especially some of journalists, their life is on the line, and they are endangered. They run into trouble, and just because they are also battling disinformation, they want to tell the truth, because they have seen a narrative, because they are, like you said, a trustworthy source in their own local communities. But when they reveal the truth, and those who were battling the falsehood deliberately may go against the safety of journalists. So that is not even the nature of the safety of journalists that some of us in war-torn places would think about. Say, okay, people carrying guns will come and kill you because you expose drugs or human rights violations or corruption. Here is like, okay, we have a problem with you because you are challenging us. You are telling the other side of the history to the people, and people would believe you because you are a local person, a local journalist. How do you think we can address this kind of a safety and security issues that local journalists face?
I think we need to deal with the question of impunity. It's really important that attacks on journalists, whether physical or actually online, are investigated and people brought to justice. Mm-hmm. I think one of the challenges, and this is something where I think I do expect so-called democracies to be much better at holding each other to account, is one of the reasons we've seen this increase, I think, in mistrust of journalists, is because governments and leaders, people in positions of political power, are sowing mistrust of journalists in their communities. When you talk about journalists as purveyors of evil, or you discredit them publicly, or you use slurs against them, that encourages the wider public to see journalists as untrustworthy, and that's really dangerous for democracy. And so one of the things I think we practically can do is, whenever we see leaders of any kind, whether that be in the United States or that be in Somalia, denigrate the profession of journalism, or even worse, go after individual journalists, they need to be called out every time. And I really expect those governments who purport to have high standards of media freedom and democracy to be leading the way on that, and unfortunately that's not something that we've seen recently. And I think there are also things that we could do, and it'd be interesting to see mechanisms to do things like reduce pylons of people on social media so that people weren't such targets. And again, the final thing I would say is, to come back to it, we also have to think about our own role in that. That are we all acting in the best manner when we see people we disagree with on social media? Can we do better ourselves? Because I think we are going to have to start to build new and better social norms, and we can't expect all of that to be done by somebody else.
Yeah, of course. Charity starts at home, and we have to put our house in order. And when there are problems, we get to tackle internally, and to be ethical and professional. And of course, I perfectly agree with you. And when politicians are showing mistrust for journalists in their own communities, defaming them, demonizing them, and creating a lot of problems. Yes.
Maybe one question, if I may.
Yes,
I'm Paolo. I work at the EAS, European Union, and of course you mentioned that one of the strategy against disinformation that I like very much is the positive one, reinforce independent journalists, independent media, etc., etc. But specifically on this, support to independent media, that is, of course, something on which we are thinking. And we have, at the European Union in particular, a long and big experience with reinforcement of civil society, with some good lessons to be learned, but also, I was working in several countries, sometimes some also mistakes or participating in creating, in some cases, a monster. So how do you see that you support to independent media could happen? Participating in global funds or country by country? Well, if you have any suggestion on this.
Well, so I think if we could see an increase in general of overseas development aid to media, that would be positive. Not all countries see media development as a key priority, and I think we've seen how important it is to have independent information providers in situations such as that we've seen as COVID. I think the second thing is really thinking critically about the role of trustworthy information providers in times of crisis can be more helpful. So I think in the past, some humanitarian assistance has not really focused on that for obvious reasons. It's focused on food and water and healthcare. I think perhaps sometimes that provision of information piece has not been as focused on. And I think I would expect to see policymakers perhaps rethink a little, particularly given the scenarios that we've seen over the past year of very rapidly closing civil space, something going from essentially proto-democracy to almost immediate closure in somewhere like Afghanistan. Really thinking about how you can continue to support individuals, media institutions who've already been supported to evolve as independent media outlets, so that they're not collapsed in a day. And thinking of that as part of the humanitarian response, I think could be a really helpful new intervention that we haven't seen up until this point.
And also to respond, Paolo, one of your questions, it was like, it could be a, global funding or whatever. It could be a national, mechanism to support independent media. But it's also quite very interesting that sometimes we have seen an environment where governments would try to dominate local, situations, so that the support goes like international institutions like Internews. They would come and know in the country what is going to happen, vet, is it going to the credible, institutions or local radio station or television or media network that rightly needs the support. So sometimes, mixing both, global funding as well as one of the national, but context is sometimes something that is needed, because you cannot use alone one size of funding by saying, okay, I will go to Kenya and then I will only fund the, a local organizations alone, but also international institutions, because they need the exposure, the expertise, and as well as, if you have 200 radio stations in Kenya, how would you come and say, look, these are the best 15 radio stations that we would support? And that, and such kind of a media organizations do have that kind of expertise.
I think that's right, Amar. And I think importantly, the key thing is there's got to be a mix of long-term institution building funding and flexible funding, because as COVID taught us, even the institutions that were quite successful, perhaps even financially successful, had no safety mechanism when the finances suddenly, because the financial model suddenly collapsed, and B, didn't necessarily have the in-house expertise to report on health and science. So they might have been very strong reporters, strong in their local communities, but reporting on health, and particularly this pandemic, is complicated and difficult, and therefore you then needed flexible funding to be able to either hire a new person or attend the kinds of courses that you needed to get up to speed very quickly. So I think it's that mix of targeted, context-driven, as Amar says, local, flexible funding with a kind of longer-term institutional approach that tries to bring a whole country or a whole ecosystem up to being more democratic and sustainable.
Yeah, very good. Anybody else who has comments or question to ask?
I don't know whether we have to return, Amar. Do we have to return to the?
Yeah, it's exactly the time we are past 2 minutes, I suspect, because it was 5 minutes past, but yeah, I think it's time for us to return, but yeah, but good.
I think someone should put in the chat the link to go back to the previous session, but I don't know who.
Yeah, even me, I was just checking that we don't have that link to go back to the to the main plenary. Wow, very interesting.
Because
I don't know whether this one will work. I can share my link. I don't know if it will. You might all end up as coming in as me. There we go. There we go.
Okay, very good.
Thank you, everyone. I hope it was useful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amar. It's lovely to chat to you.
Good, very well, thanks.
Now